Cedric now, who's been waiting very patiently, adjusting his volume and so on, and wondering what this guy is going to say about alt meats. Cedric MacLeod operates Local Valley Beef, and it's a 105-acre beef farm which provides local sustainable beef in New Brunswick, and also has an agronomy business called MacLeod Agronomics. And although he wasn't raised on a traditional farm, Cedric loved animals from an early age. He opted to attend the Nova Scotia Agricultural College to take pre-vet medicine after graduating from high school. His first year introductory agricultural course, though, set him on a completely different path. After attending a lecture on soil erosion, he realized, rightfully so, that agronomy was where he needed to be. And he set his sights on soil conservation and soil health. Cedric went on to pursue a master's degree in soil science from the University of Manitoba, graduated 20 years ago this year. After a 3.5-year stint in Ottawa with the Canadian Pork Council, Cedric returned home to New Brunswick, where he established both his farming operation, Local Valley Beef, and his agri-environmental consulting business, MacLeod Agronomics. So as a farmer, agrologist, and consultant, Cedric has a unique ability to connect with and engage fellow farmers, bringing enhanced insight and demonstrable relevance to the farming community, showing farmers they can overcome the vast challenges presented by an ever-changing and increasingly complex sector, which it is, no question. Please, in whatever way you can, welcome Cedric MacLeod.
All right, thanks for that. Is my audio okay on computer? I restart my, if it's not, I'll use my phone.
Not hearing you clearly, Cedric. I don't know if you tried the phone connection and if that was any better.
What if I do that?
That's a bit better, yeah.
Still not great?
That's okay.
That's okay. I think we can turn up the volumes a bit. That'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, okay. Just apologize. To your point, I'm actually going to be on the road here delivering some meat products around the province. So at my home office, my internet works better than it does here at the office, but it's a logistics challenge, I guess, for me today. So thing should be in good shape. Ivan, can I get a thumbs up if we're in good shape?
Yeah, we can hear that. Thanks.
Okay, great. So listen, really glad to be back with you guys in Newfoundland. Too bad we can't get together in person. I'll always love coming over and interacting with you folks. And thanks so much for getting us going, Ivan. I'm still chuckling, wondering where I can find a bottle of indigenous community saliva from Venezuela to increase my gut health, because through the pandemic we haven't been eating as good as we did before. We're certainly not as active, so anything we can do to get pumped back in shape, we'll take it. I was very happy to be over with the young farmers in November, and so folks that were at that meeting, you're going to see some similarities in this presentation. But Nikki's asked me to talk specifically to some of the greenhouse gas measures that we're looking at, I think, through various programs now in Canada, and of course the Living Labs initiative there in Newfoundland, which we are looking forward to collaborating with in New Brunswick. So Ivan did a good job of describing this triple bottom line, and so that sustainable development, well said, Ivan. It's a tricky space, and so I'm going to just walk through a few of these challenges and opportunities that we're seeing in the value chain, and how that impacts Newfoundland growers, and I'm not just focusing on what's happening at the farm level. And Ivan's cousin's examples, kind of alluded to this, is the importance of value chain integration. And there are various levels of accountability I guess decisions and promises being made that ultimately filter back down to the farm level. So somehow we need to wrestle with that when we are ultimately the price takers in this space. So I just want to start with sustainability goals. And those goals evolve and change based on what your position is within that value chain, right? So we need to be asking ourselves a number of questions here. Whose goals are they? Are they your goals? You know, to Ivan's last slide about maintaining the soil resource, the farm resource for the next generation. You know, I've got an 8-year-old son that he loves to come to the farm with me, so that gives me a very clear long-term goal on what I want my farm to look like in 12 years when he's ready to decide whether or not he wants to get in and work with me on that enterprise, or if he wants to rent that out, or but that's really shaping up the way that we are developing that operation. That's my set of personal goals. And then I've got my value chain in place. And if I use my example, I run my own value chain. I have my own brand and I direct market it. But I work with restaurants and retailers, and my wife works with me to help with logistics and marketing support. I've got a processor that helps me process that beef. So I've got numerous people that I work with, and if I was in the traditional beef sector, I would have, as a cow calf operator, I would have maybe a backgrounder that buys my animals. Maybe they're custom feeding for a feedlot in Quebec. Maybe they're, raising that beef on a corn ration because they're moving through Cargill in Guelph. And if you take a look at the sustainability pilot projects being run by the beef sector, there are individual components of that production model that require good data to be kept as we go to Ivan's point of demonstrating that sustainability. So even though I'm at the bottom of that value chain as a cow-calf operator, I still have a responsibility to set the next component of the value chain up to be successful, and on and on and on, which means we have to collaborate. We have to be on the same page. And the beef sector is a good example of probably historically an adversarial type of relationship value chain. So that in and of itself is a challenge. So then back to Newfoundland, what about the government of Newfoundland and Labrador? What are the sustainability goals? And I've got a few personal opinions I'm going to throw in. I have done some pretty intensive agronomy work with some growers from Newfoundland. Love the opportunity to come over and really understand the challenges and opportunities that are before the sector. But certainly your province, with the sustainability of keeping food on the shelf is probably the primary focus there. And then we've got our government of Canada, and we'll talk about some of the goals that they put. So let's just level set this a little bit then. Sustainability goals on the farm. What is it we're trying to achieve? And that would be annual crop productivity. The fertilizer cost that we're seeing right now, really, really critical consideration for all of us. And then I put on logistics there this morning as I was walking through it, because not only do you have to worry about pricing and availability, and thinking primarily of nitrogen fertilizer here, but also the logistics, right? We got the trucker issue, we've got convoys across Canada. We know our supply chains are restricted because of the shipping challenges, right? So how does that start to impact a grower that's trying to produce cabbage and broccoli on the island? Also know that as all of us within this on this coastal climate, we deal with that variable weather pattern, right? And we see the long periods of drought and certainly saturated soil conditions. So how do we maintain crop productivity when we know that climate forcing is upon us and we're likely to see more intense weather patterns, more ups and downs, and we're already dealing with some of that variability. So we need to be thinking about how to maintain that productivity long term. which takes us, quite honestly, towards climate change adaptation, where the majority of my work has been in the mitigation side, and we'll speak to later about BMPs that can be used. My focus is really switching now to adaptation, and that's where the resilience really starts to play a core role in this, so that we can deal with resilience. Really is dealing with fluctuation, dealing with those tough times. So then your long-term crop productivity, and we're thinking about primarily around soil health. And I say those young soils in Newfoundland and Labrador, A, because it's cold there, B, because they, your ag industry, it's been around for a long time. There's a lot of new ground that's been opened up in Newfoundland. And those soils are young from a production perspective, and they grew underneath, short, maybe in some cases pretty scraggly spruce trees. So there's not a lot of organic matter there. There's not a lot of foundation. So we really need to be focusing on driving as much carbon into those soils as we can to increase water holding capacity, to increase internal drainage capacity, to improve nutrient retention and cycling. Right, so it really all drives towards a soil health goal, and we're largely going to do that through increasing organic matter levels and then letting it exist. And letting it exist means you don't put the steel to it and turn it all back. Profitable production systems, right? We're not making money. We're not going to be able to farm. So that's always a core driver. That'll become more apparent with the value chain sustainability goals next. So then you get that mitigation, as I mentioned, right? The short-term management of greenhouse gas emissions off the farm, but certainly long-term, and I mean, to me, long-term is only 5 to 10 years. Right? We need to be readying ourselves. So is that more tile drainage to deal with wet spots of the field? Is it looking at, strategic investments in irrigation infrastructure to deal with drought? I think these are some of the challenges that we're going to have to grapple with. We'll address that as we get over to government of Newfoundland and Labrador and their sustainability goals. So here's where the rubber's really hitting the road for me. We've got these global food value chain players that are committing to these large international goals. And so your science-based targets initiative, you've got Danone making $15 billion investment in regenerative agriculture around the globe. You've got McCain Foods saying, we're going to be 100% regen practice by 2030. And that's all well and good. It's all well and good for Max to go to The Hague and say, yeah, McCain is it, count us in. The challenge with that is that 70 to 85% of the emissions out of that entire food value, that's from primary production all the way to processing, and 70 to 85% of the emissions out of that food chain comes right off the farm. So while your global value chain players are making the commitments, they're doing it on our behalf as primary growth. And we know that the things that we'll talk about at the end of the presentation, those kind of top 10 BNP ideas that I'm kind of advancing, they all add very small incremental pieces to the solution, which means we all need to be moving in a similar direction. And our collective outcome is what creates the ultimate solution. And everybody needs to play their part, and that's not always easy, and it's certainly not for an international food value chain player to collect that data in a consistent, effective way. And that's ultimately the challenge that we're going to have in maintaining these value chain goals, is having the on-farm data to prove it. And we are certainly grappling with that at scale, at current. So, yeah, there's a little bit of opportunity. I think we can look in our processing and logistics, transportation systems to grab some emissions. But again, that core opportunity is for greenhouse gas mitigation on the farm. So then we got to ask ourselves, how do we finance that? We already know that our margins are thin as primary operators. How do we finance those things? Okay. So now we're on to the government of Newfoundland. What are their goals? Well, in the larger context, Newfoundland agriculture doesn't play a huge role in Canada's greenhouse gas. But to my point just a few moments ago, we've got to pull our weight. The beauty about the DMPs that I'm advancing here allow us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions while improving productivity and profitability and long-term resilience. So that's good. We're hitting those triple bottom line, which is ultimate. Well, like I've noticed here, I've noted the provincial food supply in and of itself is the sustainability from the government of Newfoundland. Your investment programs through CAP and the policy frameworks are the envy of the world, and of the world and within Canada certainly. But we've looked at the investment your province has put into the farming sector and with admiration. But also when you come on to the island and see the unique challenges that you're dealing with, you realize that investment is very strategic and very necessary to drive that triple bottom line is set. So good on for making that investment. So then back to that fertilizer nutrient import. What is the opportunity to support that on-island food production model? Primarily nitrogen, I think, is the concern, but all fertilizer imports are a concern. And we're going to talk a little bit about biogas a little bit later. And it was my intent, I thought about it 2 days ago that I was going to put this in more detail in this slide. But if we took all the food that currently comes to Newfoundland, it all carries with it an inherent nutrient density, right? We are importing somebody else's fertilizer, food products that come to Newfoundland that aren't grown there. What if we completely close that into loop? What if every loaf of bread that went to a city or town those nutrients were recaptured, maybe through, an anaerobic type of system, whatever it might be, as opposed to the aerobic type systems we use now for waste treatment? What if we were capturing that as a source of nutrients? And I think we need to be thinking about that as we move towards peak phosphorus, right? The world doesn't have infinite phosphorus resources, that. And we've put a lot of that, we've mined it out in Florida and Morocco and other places, moved it across the world, then flushed it down the toilet and send it back to the ocean. We're not going to be able to get that phosphorus back. Or it may be sitting in a landfill, in a leachate pond underneath the land. Who knows where it is? What we do know is that we're not cycling it back to our local agriculture production system. And that is something that we need to take a hard look at. And while it may sound a little bit futuristic, I think we need to start looking at it now, because in 5 to 10 years, I think we're going to need to find it. Now, the government of Canada, what's their goals? They said straight up, nitrogen fertilizer reduction by 30%. Okay, there you go. Nitrous oxide emissions are on the rise. Potent greenhouse gas, got to deal with that. And I think we got some options to do that for our nutrient management. We need more soil carbon sequestration. Got it. They need to meet their target for Paris in 2030. They're going to try and meet that partially with soil carbon sequestration. Those nitrous oxide emissions are a major focus. And we heard in the COP meeting, COP26, there's a new methane strategy that's going to be, it was primarily targeted towards the oil and gas sector. Indications now out of Ottawa is that is going to start to leverage towards agriculture in a bigger way. So we're looking at manure storage emissions and tariff fermentation emissions from our ruminant livestock sector. So I'll address those in a few moments. So what does that mean in Newfoundland? Right? We got to deal with this nitrogen. We've got to get the very best use out of that nitrogen and use it sparingly and very, very effectively. That's the bottom line. All right. So gonna keep an eye. I don't know if there's any, if we're gonna maybe stop. An hour's a long time to just keep speaking. If there's any hands that get raised, I can see it over yonder. Somebody can raise their mic if they want to contribute. Otherwise, I have been known to just carry on for a full hour. I can see you over here. So, Ivan, you're the one that's at the top of the screen, so wave at me or something. I keep looking over here. So, resilient cropping systems, right? This is really my passion to the intro. You know, soil conservation, soil health, and minimizing the impact of what we do day to day on the soils and allowing them to express their national capacities. That's really where my passion lies. So, regenerative agriculture is something that I've been studying. You know, it's really been the core of all of my life's work, and now it's been bundled into this kind of new concept of region. And so I've struggled to kind of put that all together with how it's new. It's not really new. It's just a new brand. So all of these sustainability and these resilient cropping system principles we've talked about for a bunch of years. So I'm just going to take you through it. So you can see there, there's 7, and what are we missing? It's principle number 1. The principle number 1 is do not let excellence be the enemy of good. And I think too often in our conversations today, to a lot of Ivan's examples, it's right or wrong, it's black or white, me or you. There's only one right answer. Well, I'm here to suggest that that's not the case. I don't believe that's the case. And continuous improvement is actually where we want to find ourselves, right? We don't need to do it all at once, but we need to have continuous improvement and commit to that improvement. So let's just talk a little bit about what we're talking. So when it comes to the livestock sector, I'm just going to go another one here. There we go, right? Got our dairy guys there. So we've got methane coming out of the barn from enteric fermentation. We've got CO2 that's coming out through internal processes using energy. Well, we've also got nitrogen or ammonia, right, coming out as nitrogen. You see that blue line carries across, right? So that's where we're at the barn, right? That's our focal. Then we got manure management. Again, we've got ammonia coming off of that as indirect emissions, right? Comes over and drops down in the field, comes back as nitrous oxide. But then we've got methane in the manure storage that we need to be concerned about. And then the CO2 in red are fossil fuel energy that we're using to drive our system. Then we get over into our cropping system. We're applying that manure back onto cropland, which is good. We're closing the loop. But if we're not careful in how we run our manure application systems and our cropping systems, then we do get nitrous oxide that comes out of the field, right? So we've got to think about this on-farm value chain and where each of the pieces fit together and what we could do to minimize our emissions. So that's livestock. We go to cropping, right? Same kind of story, except the tractor is now doing the tillage and the seeding and the harvest, right? So we've got that CO2 emissions coming out from internal combustion engines. But then you get the CO2 that's coming out from behind that tillage implement. So we want to minimize the tillage, minimize the disturbance with our soils, with steel in as much as possible to keep that carbon in. The sun, working with the plants to give it to us. When we hit it with steel, turn that process around, send it back down, keep it in our soil to drive that. Go over into fertilizer management. Really, that's really coming down to your nitrogen input, right? We know that nitrogen in, nitrous oxide out, especially if we have residual fall nitrogen. So we've really got to balance our rates to make sure that we're maximizing crop productivity, but not having any excess left in the fall, because that we know, from that February, March, April, May period, soils are saturated. Excess nitrogen availability means that we get nitrous oxide coming up. And again, a very important focus of Canada right now and will be over the next 10 years. The last piece here is that crop storage and processing system. Then, so you got a grain dryer there. I know there's not a lot of grain drying in Newfoundland. What? There is a lot of grain imported to Newfoundland, and there is an inherent carbon carbon cost to that, right? So anytime we're processing or managing on farm, and this might be vegetable storages, you know, running ventilation equipment and using electricity, right? So those are pieces that we're dealing with. But back to my point earlier, there's a lot of different ways in that we're contributing very small pockets of greenhouse gas emissions to the food value chain. But when you add them all up, it's significant. So we're dealing with a largely biological system, very complex system. And so it's sometimes hard to sort our way through exactly what it is that we can do to manage our on-farm emissions. But we'll talk about it. We can get it. We can do it. The principle number 2 in resilience, right? Back to that tillage. Get rid of that tillage in as much as possible. Now, you're going to see in later slides, we talk a lot about pH management. Every time I come to Newfoundland, I talk about pH management. We've got some great lime subsidy programs in the province. Absolutely critical to be balancing off lime addition, pH correction with tillage. And so what I'm suggesting here is strategic tillage, right? We need to move away from a clean, you know, conventional tillage program year over year over year over year. We need to find ourselves in a position where we can deploy tillage strategically as necessary to mix nutrients in, to mix our lime in and get our pH corrected. But we've really got to figure out a way to keep the seal off the soil as much as possible. I've noted potato here within the presentation, but that goes for any of the crops, coal crops. You know, there's lots of local fresh veg being produced there in Newfoundland. We do have options, right? We're looking at this. It goes to the kind of the McKean effort of Regen. They are actively looking at, you know, reduced tillage options. Does that mean we're going to have no-till potatoes? I don't think so. Does it mean that we're going to do no-till on our crops outside of the potato rotation year? Yeah, I think it really does. We've got the no-till forage stand rejuvenation in there. I know I've done lots of work with that with growers in the west, on the west coast there in Newfoundland. There are opportunities to integrate no-till forage management systems quite easily in Newfoundland. Number 3, keep your soils covered. So this goes back to largely to your annual crop, folks, and those of you who may be growing corn for your dairy herds or you know, your vegetable producers. We gotta get our cover crop deployed. And I know that I always get this comment, well, Cedric, our growing season is too short. We don't have time to establish a cover crop. Well, you're right, and neither do we in New Brunswick. But there's all kinds of options that we've proven, tested, and found to be viable with more of an intercropping application. So spreading fall rye within a potato crop in August, and then digging letting those little rye seeds germinate, digging the potatoes. Don't worry about the cover crop. But lo and behold, it's there when you're done, and it re-roots, right? So we need to be thinking outside the box when it comes to cover crops. That we don't have enough time to come in after the crop is off in the majority of cases. When we establish a cover crop like they would in the Midwest, we need to be thinking about how we adapt those models to our unique areas and limitations. Living roots year-round. Perennial forage is obviously the gold standard here. Yeah, year-to-year coverage, year-to-year root matter, year-to-year solar energy collection and transfer into the soil system. But lots of other options here. We've got that Italian ryegrass, right? I've done this growing corn, grain corn over here in New Brunswick. We're putting some Italian ryegrass in with our top dress nitrogen. Right around that July 1st, we get this nice little mat of ryegrass as a cover crop there. When you take the corn crop off, all of a sudden you've got a foot of ryegrass underneath it there. It's drawing up any residual nitrogen might be kicking around. Winter wheat, we know that there's been pretty successful winter wheat crops grown in Newfoundland. Same thing with spring fertilizer. We drop a little bit of red clover seed in with the spreader, and so we can interseed those cover crops while the crop is still growing. We don't have to wait for that winter wheat to be off before we go and reestablish our next crop. So it certainly goes to the cover crop model and ideal. But again, this is more thinking about our cropping system as a whole and how we get the best bang for our buck all the way across. Principle 5, again, we'll talk about resiliency here, biodiverse cropping system. So, as you walk your way down that list of 7, that potato, barley, again, I'm kind of leveraging the New Brunswick potato sector here a little bit. Potato, barley, and underseeded clover crop would have been the standard 3-year rotation. As McCain's has offered more and more contract room, we've seen those rotations go from, maybe 4 when we used to have some cattle in a small feedlot, right? 2 years of clover, potatoes, back to barley. Now we're down into, in a lot of cases, potato barley or potato oat, and we're really not getting a diversity at all within that system when we're only alternating 2 crops year over year. So one thing we did a couple of years ago, I developed a 9-weight service crop mix. Said to some guys, look, forget about growing that crop of barley. You're not making any money on it anyway. You're a potato grower. Let's focus on building your soils and building resiliency, and just focus on your spud crop, right? And lo and behold, profitability gains on the potato more than covered off the revenue that was being generated by barley. Then you move down the list, right? Maybe you are in a 3-year rotation. So you got potatoes, and you're growing a crop of grain corn, then you're dropping in wheat. Well, if you're going to do that, let's put some Italian ryegrass under the corn, and maybe underseed the wheat with some Italian ryegrass. Now I've got 5 crops in 3 years being generated, and I haven't done anything except put seed in the seed box on the drill. Pretty simple, right? So getting biodiversity within our cropping system doesn't require a lot of special equipment, doesn't require a lot of special passes. It requires a little bit of special thinking and a little bit of long-term planning and plan for that integration. Now you can see the bottom ones there: the corn, silage, cob meal, peas and oats, and perennial forage. That's really kind of a rotation that we would see in the Sussex and mountain areas here of New Brunswick, and that really goes to our high-performance dairy operators. Very, very biodiverse. Always see lots of good perennial crops in that rotation. So, with the exception of the corn, silage, and cob meal, I know you've got a small subsidy of your dairy industry there in Newfoundland growing some corn, but that PO model and long-term forage, hard to beat for resilient principles. Principle number 6 is integrating that livestock, and I've stated this is kind of it's back. It's new. It's sexy again to have cows on the landscape. The only challenge is, we saw it here in New Brunswick. A lot of our potato growers, they had a small feedlot out behind the barn, out behind the potato warehouse, and it allowed them to integrate forages and rotations. They saw the long-term benefit. They saw the manure coming back. BSC really did away with that. We didn't have a lot of risk management options for our cow guys. So in a lot of cases, for whatever reason, back in 2003, those feedlots were filled full of fat cattle, ready to go to market. BSC hit, no market for them, nobody wanted them, nowhere to go, no risk management. Guess what they said? I'm all done with that. I'm all done with the cattle side. So now we've recognized, and PEI is a great example. The studies that Judith and her team are doing there at Agriculture and Agriculture Canada, they've shown dramatic decreases in organic matter in PEI potato soils. And guess what? You can line them almost directly back to 2003 when we lost that livestock breeding sector. So it's not as easy as saying, yep, we need cows back. This is a question of risk management. What do we have for risk management vehicles that can support reintegration of livestock into our cropping system without creating a huge new barrel of risk that an annual cropper has to carry? Because I'm here to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, the corn, soybean, wheat, canola guys, they've done really well over the last decade. They've made some good money. Commodity prices have stayed strong. Their yields are up. Technology's done it. Nutrient management's done it. Climate has changed and increased that yield potential. I've got guys and gals looking at me saying, why? Why would I even consider putting up fences again and bringing cattle? I want to go to the lake. I don't want to carry that risk. I don't want that complexity, right? So we're at a bit of a conundrum here. It's certainly a crossroads to figure out how to move through that. Love that poultry manure. You guys have got a pretty thriving poultry industry there in Newfoundland. So I think it goes back to that nutrient cycling comment from earlier. How do we get those nutrients from those poultry production areas out into your annual crop production areas and really drive or encapsulate all the good things that manure brings to a cropping system? And again, close up. So principle 7, okay, we're getting down to the end of it here. This is responsible use of fertilizer. And so, you know, I put a lot of focus on those earlier with nitrogen management, key. Very, very critical, gonna be a focus going forward. What's our option for our nutrient management? Fertilizers Canada's done a really nice job of developing this program. Really, I've always appreciated the 4R program because it does fit with my model of thinking along resiliency and sustainability. Take those pieces, the right source, rate, time, and place, and we put them all together, right? So in this case, I'm looking at my grain drill, my corn planter, my broadcast fertilizer systems. How do they all integrate to allow me to put that nitrogen exactly where it needs to be, exactly when the crop needs it, so that I'm not wasting any and I'm not having a big bunch of residual nitrogen in the soil at the end of the year. Very critical. Again, we can't talk about fertility management without bringing up pH. And so you can see when you move from that red line, which is a pH 4.5, which is where a lot of your soils would be, right? When you're going in, you're clearing off, you're pushing that tree overburden. What you're going to find underneath there is probably in the 4.5 to 5 range, right? So your overall nutrient use efficiency on that is under 30%. That's right off the hop, right? So you start to put your lines together, right? Get up to the green bar, that pH 6.0. Look what your nitrogen fertilizer efficiency, right? You're going from less than 30 to almost 90, right? So that opportunity is there for nitrogen, which is going to help out with the Government of Canada's goals. But then if you look at the overall bar here, again, moving from that sub 30 to almost 80% nutrient use, fertilizer use efficiency potential with a pH of 6.0. So a lot of these processes hinge directly on pH management, and we're looking at, you know, fancy fertilizer blends and urease inhibitors and all kinds of good things that if our pH isn't correct, we're not going to effectively get it. Nor are we going to maximize the genetic potential. Principle 8, when we talked about resilience, okay, responsible use of crop protection. And we get that, right? We're under the microscope for fungicides, herbicides, insecticides, all the rest of it. We know that we've got, you know, from time to time, you know, we're going to have insect infestations, we're going to have weed issues that need to be dealt with, and that's fine. We got to use technology to deal with it. We just need to use it sparingly. And I think the example that we're seeing coming out of the U.S. now with, you know, multiple levels of herbicide resistance, not just to glyphosate, not just to Roundup, right? But 3, 4, 5 levels of resistance to things like water hemp in the U.S. I mean, there's going to be acres in the U.S. that will be unusable because we won't be able to control those bees, regardless of how much organic matter might be in those soils. So in those cases, we might have to go back to livestock because that might be the only way to do it. So just a cautionary note to make sure that we use technology responsibly. All right. Any questions? Nobody's waving at me. All right. Now, the science, good baseline. How about something we can take home and think about this afternoon on things that we can do? So what I've done here, if you remember, those schematics I showed of the farm, right? I had the livestock farm and the cropping farm, right? And all those emission sources. I've broken those out by greenhouse gas to say, what have we got for options? So on the carbon dioxide, reducing our tillage, right? So we're looking at conservation tillage, right, and tillage and rotation, and no-till seeding wherever possible. And you're saying, Cedric, look, I tried that no-till thing in my grasslands, it didn't work. Fair enough. A lot of reasons why it may or may not work. Probably managing overburdened competition of existing crops would be number one. Number two would be inadequate weed control, would be number two. I think that is one thing that we are guilty of in the Maritimes, especially in our grassland management systems, is that we're not using the full power of herbicide technology to really start us out on the right foot. So what happens is we don't get a good catch of grass. We say, oh, it was the no-till that didn't work. We go back and pull out the mold board, we turn it all over because we know how to manage that way. But we need to evolve. The other one here is cover crops, right? We're going to keep those soils covered. Again, we're thinking about fall rye into standing crops. We're thinking about Italian ryegrass broadcast in July. We're thinking about clovers underseeded underneath of our small grains, keeping living roots within that system all year round. That's going to make sure that we minimize erosion. We're going to suck up any nitrogen that might be sticking around, and we're going to drive carbon into that soil resource all the way through. Okay, now that's soil. Still on carbon dioxide, but now we're looking at energy, right? That was the red bar in those CO2. What can we do? Well, energy efficiency is the first one, right? So we've got to have our heating systems working at full capacity, and we do that, or at maximum efficiency, and we do that by having a good building. And one thing we haven't done a good job here in Canada is enforcing the building code. There are new building codes that have increased fertilizer packages, envelopes, specs, and they haven't been enforced. So if you're thinking about building a new barn, new house, new shop, take a look to maximize that building insulation envelope to maximize efficiency of heating. Same thing with electrical. Variable frequency drive on ventilation fans within your poultry barns, or your vegetable storages, or your milk pump within the dairy sector, right? Lots of technology that we can deploy that doesn't take a lot of retrofit. It just turns your barn or your facility into a smart facility, and energy is being used as sparingly as possible. So once you've maximized your efficiency, then you move on to generation, right? So then, we've got electric energy generated with wind, some small scale, or with solar, we've got lots of barn roofs where we can fire up some solar. Yeah, I know we don't get a lot of sun, but, every little bit counts. So we need to be thinking about that as we integrate into our building design long-term. I'm not a huge fan of small-scale wind. I'd rather see communities come together and install more large commercial-scale wind turbines. I think they found quite a bit of success on this in Germany, where they had individual communities that invested in those larger machines as opposed to having them distributed around the landscape. The small-scale wind systems tend to require a lot of maintenance and ultimately tend to lead to failure. Biomass is an opportunity there, both for electrical energy and thermal energy generation, and of course biogas, right? It takes us back to our manure storage. What can we do there just to collect that biogas? And think about food waste. Think about the 25% of our food products that go into the garbage can. If they went into a compost bucket and that was collected with the restaurant waste and the food processing waste, and that was entered into a biogas system, not only are you going to take the methane out of the landfill, you're going to generate more electrical energy on the farm, and you're getting those nutrients back. Maybe the most critical piece, closing that nutrient loop. So energy isn't always just about CO2. You need to be thinking about it holistically. Then, of course, thermal energy, right? Hot water, solar panels, and then I've got biomass in there too, right? There's biomass kicking around in the land, lots of opportunities. Okay, switch gears, going to methane, right? And you notice what are we doing? We've got 1, 2, I've got a top 10 list. That's 3 and 4 is energy and CO2. Moving to 5 and 6. So now we're talking about livestock and manure and methane emissions. What can we do to tackle that? Well, if you're a dairy or beef operator, you're going to balance that ration, right? You're gonna grow as high quality forage as you can, and then you're going to balance it out to its maximum efficiency. Feed additives is something to be looking at. I know we've got seaweed extracts that we're looking at that significantly reduce methane emissions from fermentation. Really interested in that technology and where that might take, right? But how do we integrate that to our feeding systems? Maintaining at least 50% legume content of the forage stand. And working with one of my mentors from University of Wisconsin, Dr. Dan Understander, we talked about this repeatedly. We can maintain 40 to 50% legume in all of our forage stands. We can eliminate the need for supplemental nitrogen fertilizer. So what does that do? Drives profitability and reduces nitrous oxide emissions and maximizes the quality of our forage. Great little bundle of opportunities. Can't talk about ruminant feeding without talking about pasture management. Ivan, I'd love to come over and do another little pasture management workshop, teach you all about intensive management grazing. We could fire up some demos over there in Newfoundland. I'd love to do something like that, but it's definitely a critical component. When you move over to storage, BMP number 6, you got really only a couple options there. You can either manage how you empty that storage, or you can cover. And when we cover it, we keep the methane in the system. Now, straw covers would be perishable cover. Biogas systems would be a permanent cover, which really do give us collection, storage, and then use of that methane. But we're not going to see that biogas system typically on farm unless we get a good distributed renewable energy program coming through, right? So now, you're going through numerous levels of government to get into some really good policy development. Not saying that you shouldn't, saying it takes a lot of effort to get there, but I think it is, with methane becoming more of an important focus in agriculture. We need to be looking for those options. Now, the emptying management side, what we really want to do is empty those storages as often as possible and as completely as possible. So it may be where when we're designing storages, we're putting a sump in so that we can remove all of it. Because what happens is when the manure comes in, the methanogenic bacteria that exist in the manure storage, they have to build their community. So if we remove that manure off, that community doesn't get a chance to build. Now, if we always maintain our manure pits as half full, that means we always have an active methanogenic community there, and we're feeding them continuously with new sources of food. But if we pull them all out, those communities have to reestablish themselves to carry through. So I know this is a difficult challenge to go along with that, but those are the kind of things that we need to be thinking about for methane. Over to soils now on the nitrous oxide side of things, right? So BMP number 7 here is fertilizer nitrogen management. And you see it go right before our nutrients, the right product, rate, time, and place. Just really about strategic placement and timing, how we use the nitrogen fertilizer. Wherever we can, we're precision, applying those, ideally through variable rates, talk with them. Well, cover cropping becomes a really important piece to nitrous oxide because, say we've got to fertilize to maximize our potato crop, we need 135 units of nitrogen out there. Well, we had a dry season. We only got 2/3 of the yield. So then I'm automatically going to have probably 35 pounds of nitrogen residual sitting out. Well, that's not my fault. Rain didn't come. So what can I do to deal with that? Your cover crop. That's where the cover crops not only draw down carbon and drive organic matter additions, but they're sucking up that extra nitrogen. And they're going to hold that nitrogen in a sequestered form for the next crop. So not only are we tackling a greenhouse gas issue, we're tackling a profitability issue, because you just saved yourself $17 an acre on nitrogen fertilizer. Mentioned earlier about precision fertilizer. I really think we need to get to a point where we've got broad, widespread use of variable rate application technology with swath control, automatic swath control. So regardless of who's out there in the fertilizer spreader, when you get to that point row and it starts to overlap with where you just came from, that machine automatically starts to shut down the way that it spins so that you're not double applying. And it's really hard to do manually. There's a lot going on out there, but we've got the technology that'll allow us to do it automatically, and it'll track it. It'll make it. It'll generate a map for us. So when Ames or AgriPure or whoever says, I need your fertilization, you can hand them the file and say, here's exactly. And again, you can't get through a nitrogen conversation without pH correction. So what about manure? Same kind of thing. Notice I struck out product there because we can't choose, whether or not calcium nitrate or urea that we're using. We've got what we've got in terms of manure. So that just comes down to planning. But you notice everything else is the same. Everything else is the same. And this is important, especially for livestock operations, maybe a little bit undersized in manure storage. They're going out with fall manure application, making sure we've got some cover crops out there to suck up that nitrogen, maintaining our perennial forages, absolutely critical. And then we're down to precision nitrogen application. And John Deere has actually taken their NIR technology that exists on their forage harvesting unit that'll give you forage quality and yield and moisture at the same time. You can put that on the back of your manure spreader. It will automatically determine the nutrient content of your manure. And using gate valves, you can do the same thing that a precision fertilizer spreader will do, only with manure. And again, we're mapping, right? So we're really starting to pinpoint how we use those manure resources. Is that off into the future? You bet. Is this something we need to start thinking about right now? Absolutely. Okay, coming down on it here, 9 and 10, right? So now we're thinking about the carbon-rich components of our land, right? Riparian areas around it, perennial forages and pasture land. Lots of carbon stored in those perennial forage lands. How do we maintain that carbon? Our wetlands, shelter belts, all those carbon-rich habitat features. We need to be thinking about them, cataloging them, quantifying them, and making sure that those values are being brought into our carbon accounting that Ivan had mentioned earlier in his presentation. The importance of taking that out to the public to share with them about what we're doing to steward that carbon on these habitat features. And across. The last one, and I think this is another critical piece for Newfoundland, and I'm not sure how much traction this has gotten as of late, but precision landscape management and starting to use geospatial mapping, zone mapping of our fields, and collecting soil samples by zone and starting to manage them zone by zone by zone within productivity areas of the field, critical. And this technology has really only taken a hold here, at least in the mainland, in the last decade, largely driven by the potato sector. But what we're starting to see is we integrate field monitors and zone zone soil sampling. We're starting to identify areas of the field that are much more productive than others. So that's to the last point there. It's something I call farm your best acre. So if the government of Canada is saying to me, Cedric, you've got to reduce your nitrogen fertilizer sector, my first move is to say, all right, I've got a 30-acre field. my yield map says that 7 of those 30 acres are net net negative profitability. Maybe it's headlands, maybe it's wet areas, or thin soils on the knoll. I'm saying those 7 acres, I shouldn't farm. If I'm going to be forced to reduce my nitrogen fertilizer, that's where I'm going to do it, because I never made money on those areas of the field anyway. What I want to do is take that nitrogen budget that I have and deploy it to the areas of the field where I know I can make it. I know I can get maximum. And those 7 acres, maybe they go back to nature. Maybe they go to permanent cover. Maybe they should be a wetland. Maybe I should put a pond in there. Or maybe I should plant trees on. But when we know those areas that we're not making money on, we can start to make, calculated decisions on how we achieve all the goals, all the stakeholders that I started off mentioning. So again, back to that bottom line, and really that last slide, that last concept really goes to the people, right? And we're starting to understand and quantify and speak to the work that we're doing within agriculture to significantly increase our efficiency. And we've done that in the last bunch of decades. We've really increased the efficiency of our system. Do we have more to do? Are there more opportunities? You bet. You've got a top 10 list of things there. I think some of those are probably going to be encapsulated in that Newfoundland Living Labs initiative. Going to drive some more profit, going to deal with the greenhouse gas emissions, and really see that triple bottom line. So, as always, wish I could be with you guys to have a drink or a cup of coffee and slide through some of these scenarios and what it really means to your farm. I know there's a lot of complex ideas in here. Hopefully that top 10 left at the end helped to bring it a little bit into focus. Here's my digit. You know how to get a hold of me. Give me a buzz. Happy to talk through any of these things as you wish. I'll leave it at that. If there are some questions, I'll take some questions, and if not, I've got a couple more slides here that just to identify some upcoming programming that will help to deploy some of these things.
I haven't seen any questions yet in the chat, but why don't you put some slides up? And while you do that, I want to appreciate your talk, Cedric. It was great because you not only bring in the science there, but your very real world examples and your discussion about, well, how does somebody who is, you were talking about reintegrating animals, how does somebody who's worked as a crop farmer for so long and that's worked fine, how do you entertain the idea of increasing your risk by doing that? And I think having that kind of real world example of how do you complicate your life, it's sobering. And I was hoping you would have lots of suggestions about good programs that are happening, and if you change part of that 7 acres that isn't working and you rewild it, that's the big term these days, can you get any money from the government for doing that?
You bet. So this is I'll take the last, I guess I got 4.5 minutes here by my counter. Somebody's trying to reach me here. So the On-Farm Climate Action Fund, right? So this is a new project announced by Minister Bibeau just before the last federal election, $200 million. We've got money coming down for 3 focus areas. One is cover crop integration. And so out of $200 million, about $21 million notionally allocated to the Maritime, right? So split that up, we're looking at 4 or 5, maybe 6 coming into Brunswick, right? There's going to be a share that drops into Newfoundland. Cover crop integration is one of them. That's the first BMP, right? So all those things I talked about with red clovers and Italian ryegrasses and fall rye, most of the proposals that have come forward have basically been to subsidize 50% of the seed cost for doing that. But to your question, you bet, they're coming. Number 2, soil fertility management. It's largely nitrogen focused, right? So if you want help in building out your 4R nutrient management program, or you want to do a nutrient management program for your manure, or you want to look into that John Deere NIR monitor and put some gate valves on your manure spreaders so you can do precision manure application out there, you bet. We've also, through the Canadian Forage and Grassland Association, a group that I work with, we've advanced the idea of paying for some legumes, right? To get, again, give that 40 to 50% legume in our forage stands, not just for storage forage, but also on your pasture, right? So yes, we're looking at deploying nitrogen management through additional seed costs and technology deployment. And the last one, you know, specific to your point about reintegrating livestock, rotational grazing. So we have identified pasture management and enhanced intensity pasture management as a key driver for increasing soil carbon storage. So the proposal that we've advanced, again through the CFGA, is to support building a grazing plan and then deploying that infrastructure either with fencing or water systems to support better grazing management. Right. So those programs are coming. We expect to hear back within the next week or so on who the successful applicants of that program were going to be. Not sure where that lands in Newfoundland, but I think it's something that we need to be thinking about. And the last thing I'll say, Ivan, I think this is likely to be what we see into the future. We've seen the Guelph statement, which is largely focused on resiliency in our cropping systems, risk management, greenhouse gas mitigation, right? Minister Bibeau announced $200 million. We've been trying to drive carbon offset programs, which really haven't worked great for agriculture because of the need for aggregation, right? It's that everybody doing small pieces that gets to the larger outcome. So what the government of Canada is really focused on is saying, okay, we're not going to likely get carbon treated that way. We're going to pay you for the BMP that generates the offset, and we're going to assume that in Canada. So this $200 million has been advanced. My crystal ball says we're going to see.
That sounds great. How do people keep up on these? You say in a week we're going to find out more about it. Are there some websites or some organizations that you would suggest people go to?
Yeah, I think probably the Federation is in Newfoundland is going to be your best bet. Certainly, the Living Lab initiative and the knowledge and translation tech transfer strategy coming through that. That's going to be your best conduit. And I think as we look at that Living Lab and proving out those BMPs and really showing them at commercial scale, our opportunity is going to be to say, all right, now here's how it works. Here's the things you need to do. Here's the funding package you need to go to help deploy it.
Yeah, great.